This video is about the various names of what I am now calling a shell. A shell is a prefix, non-decreasing, identity-preserving map of cancellative monoids. And shifting a monoid, shifting a shell by an element of its in its domain monoid is well defined by the cancellation property. In fact, I'm actually sort of curious. I don't think you need cancellation property in the domain. So it may make more sense to define a shell to be a map from a monoid to a cancellative monoid. And this way we can expand the class of objects that are considered shells. And of course other conditions can be placed on the domain and the codomain, but for the moment I don't think we need a cancellation property in the domain. Other words I've used are transducer, homography, telephone. Words I've used for specific kinds of shells are mill, motor, meter, flow, record, a record is a map from a commutative monoid to a cancellative monoid. And a mill is a map from the direct product of a monoid and a commutative monoid to a cancellative monoid. And the factors in the domain of a mill are called the configuration and the resource. And the resource is an element of the commutative monoid, and the configuration is an element of the not necessarily commutative monoid, which is thought to be typically not commutative. In fact, typically a free monoid on a finite set of letters. It's possible to add the condition of being what I'm calling invertible free, which means the product of any two elements in the monoid, if it is equal to the identity, that necessarily implies that both factors are equal to the identity as well. It's possible to add the condition on a monoid of being embeddable in a group. This means there is an extension monoid that is a group. It's possible to study automorphisms that preserve either a submonoid or commute with the operation of a shell. So this is shell theory. It's also worth pointing out, in the past I've called a shell an encoding. And in fact, frankly, there's a huge effort to define a context in the sense that is a simulation of mathematics where in a sense, what I would describe as hardened codes or hard codes are not, don't exist. We simply don't sort of suppress. I guess, frankly, we actively, and another question, is this surreptitious or not? Is all suppression surreptitious? But we actively suppress any anxiety. This is the important point. We actively suppress any anxiety related to the problem of the attacker. So in other words, we define the attack problem, but we make sure that is a part of military code theory. Now, the problem here is that defining the boundary of military code theory is something we want to avoid because we're building a foundation and military code applications are one part of that foundation. They are not the entirety of the foundation. However, we must understand what is the correct attitude or values or approach or perspective to have on the military code theory. And that, I believe, is to first of all define the attack problem. And the attack problem is the model of a well-known model of encryption. And in other words, it's what we can do is we can view the shell in the following way. We can define the shell to be an encoding, the domain to be the plain text space, and the codomain to be the encrypted text, or the ciphertext. I think it's the ciphertext space. I barely know the terms. And I think the point here is that we sort of encase or create not a cyst but a cocoon for the military code theory. And we do that through the language of the shell and the ordinary mathematical language, and we avoid the language of the plain text and the ciphertext and encoding and decoding and attacker, but we do define the attack problem. The attack problem is finding the inverse of a shell, or rather, it's going to be a little bit strange here. What we're going to do is we're saying the attack problem is, and of course, well, what does it mean to find a mathematical object now? Whatever, you know. But the issue here is then to refocus sort of on the concept that the encryption is behind you, the hacking is behind you, you have the shell.